Everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Michele Feldman, and I'm the State Campaigns Director for the Innocence Project. And we know this is a really tough time for everybody, so we really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join us today. We have a great panel to talk about exoneree compensation in Maryland and the impact of COVID-19 on exonerees and innocent people who are still behind bars. We have Demetrius Smith, who was exonerated of murder in Baltimore after spending 5 years behind bars. And even though the actual perpetrator is convicted and currently serving his sentence, Demetrius is not eligible to be compensated. We also have Sean Armbrust, who's a director of the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, which works to exonerate wrongfully convicted people in Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Michele Nethercott is the director of the University of Baltimore Innocence Project Clinic. And finally, we have Walter Lomax, who's the director of the Maryland Restorative Justice Initiative. And he spent 39 years in prison for a murder in Baltimore that he didn't commit. Everybody who helped make this an incredible year for innocence reforms in Maryland. We advocated for two major bills, one to fix the exoneree compensation law and the other to prevent wrongful convictions involving jailhouse informants. And because of so many people who are on this call now who talk to their delegates and their state senators, we really got major progress on both issues. So I'll start with giving some details about what happened in the legislature this session, and then we'll talk about next steps. And before I turn it over to our panelists, so starting with some good news, the state legislature unanimously passed a bill that was sponsored by Senator Will Smith and Deborah Delegate Davis that will prevent wrongful convictions involving jailhouse informants by requiring more transparency and tracking their use throughout the state. And this is going to be a major way to prevent wrongful convictions because 4 exonerees in Maryland, their convictions involved lying jailhouse witnesses. And the next step is that the bill is now on the governor's desk, and he has until mid-May to sign it or veto it, or if he takes no action, it will automatically become law. Unfortunately, the exoneree compensation issue didn't pass the legislature. It's really disappointing because we have so many dedicated lawmakers and advocates who have been trying to fix this law for years. The situation really became urgent last summer when 5 exonerees had been waiting over 18 months after they applied for compensation and still hadn't gotten any response from the Board of Public Works. And the local media did a really great job of spotlighting the issue and keeping it on the public's radar. And the House of Delegates followed up by sending a letter asking the Board of Public Works to grant compensation. And finally, they did in October to the 5 exonerees, including Walter Lomax. But even though these 5 exonerees were compensated, it took way too long, and it was really clear that the process was broken and needed to be fixed. So Governor Hogan called on the legislature to fix the compensation law once and for all this session. And our 2 bill sponsors, Delegate Kathleen Dumais and Senator Dolores Kelly, introduced legislation that the Innocence Project worked on with Scott Schellenberger, the head of the State's Attorneys Association. We came up with what I think is a really strong and balanced bill. We had great support in the legislature. There was no opposition raised during the public hearings. No concerns were raised by lawmakers. And the bill passed the House of Delegates with bipartisan support. But then when it got to the Senate, things changed, and all of a sudden a group of Republican senators decided to oppose the bill. We normally don't like to call out lawmakers, but what happened was so egregious, we really wanted to address it. So Senator Bob Casilli and Senator Justin Reedy, they're both on the Senate committee that heard and voted on this bill. They didn't raise any concerns when we had public hearings in their committee. We didn't hear anything from them until almost the final day of session. And then they decided to run out the clock on the bill, knowing that the legislature was trying their best to wrap up because of the COVID-19 crisis. They ended 3 weeks early, and everybody was feeling anxious and needed to leave, understandably. So Senator Casilli and Reedy, they first tried to filibuster the bill. And then when that didn't work, they used other procedural tactics to prevent a final vote. So the Senate did vote on the bill, the full Senate, and it passed, and it needed a final reading. And these senators prevented that from happening. And the argument that Senator Casilli used was that our bill gave states' attorneys too much power, which makes no sense because the current law only allows the states' attorneys to decide who gets compensated and the governor. And our bill would have shifted that power to a judge. And he also used the bill to attack state's attorney Marilyn Mosby, which really had nothing to do with compensating innocent people. And it was just really shocking and disappointing that the governor called to the legislature to fix this law, and members of his own party decided to kill it at the last minute. It was really unfair to use the COVID-19 crisis and the rush to end session to deny innocent people their chance at getting compensation. And as you can imagine, exonerees who were already struggling without compensation are only going to have more difficulties because of this pandemic. So the good news is that we're not giving up. We have so many supporters, and we built a really great foundation for next year. And the truth is that the real work gets done before the legislative session. So this is an election year. Lawmakers are really paying attention to what their constituents think. And now is really the time to get started talking to your delegates and your state senators. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the problems with the law and how the bill would fix the law so that everybody can advocate. And I'll give you some tips on how to reach out to your lawmaker and start the conversations. So Maryland is one of 35 states that has an exoneree compensation law. And the point of these laws is supposed to provide an efficient and straightforward way for the state to repair the damage of a wrongful conviction. But unfortunately, that's not what's happening in Maryland. Most innocent people don't qualify, and the few that do are waiting way too long to get compensation. And it's not just bad for exonerees, but it's also bad for taxpayers because the alternative to state compensation is for exonerees to file a federal civil rights lawsuit. And those cases often take years to resolve, and taxpayers pay the cost of litigation. And even though it's really difficult for exonerees to prevail, when they do, there's no limit on the amount that they can be awarded. And in Maryland, taxpayers have already paid over $24 million in federal civil rights lawsuits. So taxpayers are paying one way or another. And the best solution is really to fix the law so that there's a uniform, fair process for everybody. So the legislation that we advocated for this session would have addressed three major issues. First, the law doesn't have a set amount of compensation for each year that a person is wrongfully incarcerated. And that means that payments are being decided on a case-by-case basis. The second problem is that the Board of Public Works has complete discretion over who qualifies, how much they're compensated, and when they get compensation. And the Board of Public Works is really not the appropriate entity to take this issue on. Its role is really funding capital projects, not dealing with legal issues. And the third problem is the eligibility requirements. They're completely unfair. So in most states, to be eligible, all the person has to do is bring proof of innocence, which is not an easy thing to do, but it's a fair way to compensate people. And in Maryland, there are several different laws that a person can overturn their wrongful conviction through, but only two of those ways allow a person to be compensated. So right now, an exoneree can only get compensated if they get a pardon from the governor, or if the state's attorneys approve a writ of actual innocence. Many exonerees, including those exonerated with DNA evidence and people who were exonerated and given a writ of actual innocence, but the state's attorney doesn't agree with it, even though a judge does. And as I mentioned, Demetrius Smith, who we'll be talking to, the real perpetrator is now in prison for the crime in his case. So there's no doubt that he's innocent, but because he wasn't exonerated under the writ of actual innocence law, he can't be compensated. So our legislation would have provided a fixed amount of money per year of wrongful incarceration. So it would provide $81,000, which is the amount that the Board of Public Works gave to the 5 exonerees who got compensated in October. It's also the state's median household income. The second thing the bill would do is have a judge decide who's eligible and when they get paid instead of the Board of Public Works. And the third is that it would make eligibility based on, like most states do, instead of which law a person was exonerated under. So as I mentioned, now is really the time to start talking to lawmakers. We've posted a link on this Facebook page where you could sign up for alerts on the bill, and you could be connected directly to your state senators and delegates by phone or email or Twitter. And just a few quick tips on communicating with your lawmakers. So you can find out who your state senator and delegate is by clicking on the link or by going to the Maryland General Assembly website and typing in your address. It's also helpful to know if your lawmakers are on one of the committees that will be voting on the bill, and that's also available on the website. The second important thing is just to keep your message simple and straightforward. You want your lawmakers to know that you're a constituent, you care about exoneree compensation, and you want to know what they think to support the issue next session. And it's also always helpful to personalize the message and explain why you care. And if you're inspired today by hearing the stories of Demetrius or Walter, let your lawmakers know that. And finally, the more personal the communication is, the more impact it typically has on a lawmaker. So phone calls and in-person meetings are usually the most effective, even though in-person meetings are probably not going to be possible in the next few months. Lawmakers really don't pay much attention to mass emails that are cut and paste and have the same content. However you communicate, the bottom line is that you should show that you put some thought in it and that you really care about the issue. So again, I want to thank everyone on this call who took time to call their state lawmakers this session. And if we keep up the good work, we'll be in a great place for next year. And now is really the time to start. So I'm going to now switch gears and talk to our panelists a little, starting with Demetrius Smith. Demetrius, are you on? So Demetrius Smith. Hi, Demetrius. How are you?
Hey, how you doing?
Good. So I'm just going to give everyone a little bit of background on your case. Demetrius Smith was wrongfully convicted of murdering a man named Robert Long in Baltimore based on false jailhouse informant testimony. When his case was on appeal, the Federal Drug Enforcement Agency just happened to hear a man named Juan Morales, who they were investigating for drug smuggling, confess to killing Long. And Demetrius was released from prison, and Morales went on to be convicted of the killing, and he's currently serving a prison sentence for it. But Demetrius is not eligible for compensation. Demetrius, Hello? Can you talk a little bit about what happened the day that... Hi, Demetrius, can you tell me a little bit about what happened when you got arrested for the crime and you knew nothing about it?
Well,
Demetrius,
hello?
Yep, we hear you.
Oh, I said, well, I was coming out early in the morning. Me and a friend of mine came and knocked on the door for me. And when I came out, I seen a black truck driving around the block constantly. So I didn't pay it no mind, but I did pay it some mind. And when we got up to the corner, they jumped out and said, "Is you Demetrius we looking for?" And I was like, "No, you can't be." I can't be the one. And he said, "Yeah, I think you the one." And he said, "Well, if you're not the one, we'll let you go. We just got one for questioning." So they took me down to the Central Police Station where when I got in the room, Detective Holman and Detective Beefield was in there. And as soon as I got in there and sat down, he said, help yourself out. Just that was his first words. And I was like, help myself out. Like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? And he just kept saying, come on, help yourself out. And after that, by then, I said, I don't know what you're talking about. I want a lawyer. So he got mad. He got mad and said I was going to jail. And that's where I went, in Central Brooklyn. And I didn't find out who I was locked up for probably till I was ready to go to bail review.
Wow, yeah. And I know that jailhouse informants played a big role. And there was a jailhouse informant who testified that he saw you commit the crime, which was completely untrue. What can you tell us a little bit more about the jailhouse informant in your case?
Well, I wouldn't trust him. Nobody wouldn't trust him. I in my eyes, I think that the state's attorney knew that he was lying. He had to, and he wanted he wanted some help for him cooperating, like telling them that I'd done it. He wrote the judge and everything.
Yeah,
trying to get out.
Right. So he had a real motivation to lie to get leniency in his own case. And that's exactly what our bill will address. And so after you heard that the DEA got a confession from the real killer, what was your reaction? Were you shocked that this happened? How did you feel at that moment?
Well, I was kind of happy, but it just made me look at the system different.
Right.
That it wasn't right. So.
And so, what was your reaction when you got out and there was no doubt that you were innocent, but you found out you couldn't get compensation?
Well, I thought it was wrong because I really didn't do it, and they had proof that I didn't do it. They didn't even say it. They were sorry. So I was kind of shocked.
Right. And what do you think? What was the biggest thing that you lost in that time? Like, what to you was the most devastating?
Time with my child. Time away from my family. Everything. Like, they kidnapped me.
Absolutely.
Pretty much.
And being an exoneree who hasn't gotten compensation, how has COVID-19 impacted you?
Well, it impacted me a lot. It impacted a lot of people. Like it impacted everybody, but it impacted me too because it impacted me in a couple ways. So right now, don't nothing surprise me like with the system will do or what they do. Don't surprise me. So at one time it would have because you only seen stuff like that on movies. But come to find out, it's really true. I guess what they put in movies have happened before, or has possibility of happening. So.
And you were saying that I know that you work and you have your own landscaping business. Can you talk about how the COVID-19 crisis is being affected by it?
Yeah, affected my business. I can't do nothing.
Right,
I can't do nothing.
You have to shelter in place. And you also work at a hospital. What's it been like there?
Terrible. Very, very, very terrible. Chaos.
Yeah. And so how would compensation make a difference in your life?
It will make it 100% better because I ain't got to worry so much about where I'm going to get the money to pay the next bill from or something like that. It will help out a lot.
Yeah, and what would
I will
you?
have a cushion, some type of support to fall back on when things like this happen.
Right. And so after spending so many years in prison, what are your concerns about 19's impact on the prison system? And do you still talk to anybody in prison, and what are you hearing from them?
Well, I still talk to a couple people in prison, but all they say they on lockdown.
Mm-hmm. Are they
Like,
are they scared about?
I mean, I'm pretty sure they is because you know the the system, the way their doctors and stuff is, and they're like they don't really care, so they're not going to treat you the way they're
Yeah.
supposed to treat you. And
And
technically, a lot of guys in prison, you know, they work out every day. They've been working out probably for 10 or 20 years. Half of them, they
mhm,
pretty much healthy, but like I said, there's a lot of germs in prison, so.
right. And how did it feel? You came to Annapolis a bunch of times this session. You really told your story and poured your heart out to these lawmakers. What was it like to find out that compensation law didn't pass?
That they don't care, that they gonna keep being the same people that they've been. That's why you gotta vote them out.
Well,
That's
thank you
what it
so
is.
much, Demetrius, for sharing your story and for all the great advocacy work you did this year. Um, we really appreciate it. And so next, we're going to talk to Michele Nethercott. She's a director of the University of Baltimore Innocence Clinic, and she's been working for years now to try to fix the state compensation law. So, Michele, can you talk about your work on the compensation task force?
I had been working for actually for years on trying to improve this compensation system. And that work was going on prior to 2017, but Maryland went well over a decade without a single person receiving any compensation. And in 2017, the legislature made one minor amendment to the law saying that people who have it gave an alternative to a gubernatorial pardon as a way to qualify for compensation. And that was a certification from the state's attorney if a person got relief through one particular statute. So in 2017, that change was made, and there was a task force created by the legislature. And going forward, there were actually 5 exonerees who had obtained these certificates from states' attorneys because getting a gubernatorial pardon is virtually impossible for most people. And they had filed compensation claims with the Board of Public Works, and were going 12 to 18 months, not only not receiving any compensation, they weren't even getting acknowledgement that the Board of Public Works had received these claims. So the task force was created. It was chaired by Scott Schellenberger, state's attorney for Baltimore County. There were members on the task force from the governor's office, from Mr. Lomax was on it. I was on it. There were a variety of different stakeholders. And we hashed out a lot of these issues. We came up with a consensus recommendation about changes that needed to be made in the law. We tried to get the law that the task force endorsed passed. That went nowhere. And so more recently this fall, Scott Schellenberger, Senator Kelly, Delegate Dumais, and I met, and we came up with a plan to try and draft a bill that would have the best chance of success and that represented the consensus of the task force about what the main ingredients, so to speak, in this law needed to be. We all agreed it needed to be a much more streamlined, predictable, and fair process, and also one that acknowledged that the state does have fiscal constraints, and if you set up a scheme where people are bankrupting the state. It's long-term not really a viable approach. So I really thought, after a lot of groundwork had been done, and this issue's come up in front of the legislature session after session. I thought that we had some good momentum going, and we had press attention to the issue. Finally, as a result of this press attention, the 5 folks who had these claims pending before the Board of Public Works did actually receive compensation. Of course, a number of people, like my client Demetrius, who you've just heard from, and others, just don't meet the criteria in the currently existing law, which is really kind of ridiculous if you think about it. If you're exonerated as a result of DNA testing through that statutory provision, you're not eligible. And I actually think that we were right. We did have quite a bit of momentum. We had successful hearings. I think we did everything that we could possibly do to set the stage for this going forward. And shockingly, Mr. Lomax, who's been championing this and many other issues for so many years, right before we were about to testify, had a heart attack in the State House and got a visit from Senator Ferguson. And I remember reading about that, Walter, and you were saying the only message you wanted to send out was, "I'm okay, please pass this bill." And we got so close. It's just really disappointing that we basically had, that this bill did not fail on the merits. I think we persuaded not just committee members, but legislators that this was both a prudent, a fair, and the right thing to do. And, we just got caught in a sort of combination of COVID-19 and a procedural maneuver. And so that's where we are.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, what is the impact that you've seen on your clients who are exonerated and don't get compensated? And how do you think that COVID-19 will, impact them now?
Well, obviously it's going to make it even more extraordinarily difficult for them than it already was. People, exonerees coming out with no support whatsoever. They don't even get the support that people coming out through parole or mandatory release get. You can just imagine, even forget about COVID-19, but just going and trying to get a job and explaining to an employer why there's this 15 or 20 year, or even if it's 5 years gap where, and you start explaining you in prison, but you didn't really do it well. That doesn't always go so well. Now, of course, the employment situation is going to be even more dire because of the impact on the economy from the coronavirus. And it's going to be very difficult. It's going to make what was already a very difficult situation even more difficult and possibly desperate, because people just aren't going to be able to have a source of income. Some exonerees are relatively lucky that they have family members that have the wherewithal and the means to support them. But for those who don't, it's really a pretty dire situation.
So you said something, I just want to reiterate this. People who are exonerated are getting less services.
Yes.
Than if they did the crime and got out on parole. Wow.
Right. I mean, there's at least, when you come out as through the parole process, or you come out because you've completed your sentence. I mean, I'm not saying that's great, but there are the Division of Correction does some preparatory work for that. I mean, it tries to come up with a release plan. You do get, a certain amount of money. Things are at least somewhat in place. Exonerees, they tend to come out with absolutely none of that. I mean,
right.
Easily. One of the biggest issues exonerees face is they can't get identification. And you can't get identification, you can't get medical assistance, you can't do much of anything in our society now without, proper identification. And you can just imagine many of them also are coming into a world that's very different than what it was like when they were sent off to prison. And so it's just a massive transition. And then, of course, employment is a huge problem.
Right. And I mean, you also have clients who are currently behind bars and you're working to overturn their convictions. What do you think the impact of COVID-19 is having on them, and what are you hearing from them? What are their concerns?
Well, I'm sure the impact is not good. And quite honestly, I'm not sure I actually am hearing from them, because I think I was probably one of the last people to get, and they weren't really sure they were even going to admit me about, I guess, 3 weeks ago. I had a visit with one of my clients. After that, it was unclear to me that I was even going to be able to get any kind of access, remote or otherwise. And I've just sent letters out to clients saying, basically, this is what's going on. So I don't even know, because my ability to communicate with my clients is seriously eclipsed by everything that's going on here. But it's terrible. I mean, I have one client who has really bad kidney disease, and I'm extremely concerned about him because of, his health condition, which is going to make him very vulnerable to this virus. And I'm really quite terrified that, I mean, if you wanted to imagine a perfect breeding ground for an epidemic outbreak, it would be our jails and prisons. They're overcrowded. The medical care is inadequate. They're not clean. You can't get soap. That's not, you have to have money to go to the commissary and buy soap. You can't isolate yourself, obviously. So it was just the perfect laboratory. If you had a, malignant desire to set off an epidemic, it would be the perfect place to do it. So it's very concerning. I mean, I'm just worried about, frankly, whether some of my clients are physically going to survive this. And the problem, of course, is the courts, which don't give any docketing priority to these cases that involve innocence claims to begin with. We're now going to be even further deferred, because I'm sure that the priority when the courts are back up and running are going to be pretrial detainees who are pending charges and haven't been able to get to trial because of, the suspension of the court functioning. But, even when we get past this, whenever we do, we're going to have a further backlog with the courts to even get these cases set in for hearings.
Wow.
So
yeah.
I'm
a lot
very
of
concerned about it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Michele. And now we'll turn over to Sean Armbrust, who is the director of the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, and you cover the states, or the 3 areas of Virginia, Maryland, and DC. So Sean, you also came to the legislature several times this session and advocated for compensation. What did it feel like when you found out it didn't pass?
Thank you so much for having me and thanks so much to everybody who's here. The start of the legislative session was really amazing. We put together this terrific briefing with, I think, 12 exonerees, and it was just amazing to watch them use their collective voices, which, had been silenced for so long and no one had listened to them for so long, and see them use those voices in such a powerful way. And then when the bill died, this inglorious death, kind of killed the last minute by these Republican senators using coronavirus to get it done. It's really heartbreaking to see that happen, but also to see that their voices in the end didn't matter to those senators. And it was hard to watch. Our clients have been failed by the system in so many different ways. And it's really hard to watch that happen again and again. I can't imagine what it's like for them, because I know how hard it is to see.
Absolutely. Yeah, I share those feelings, and I'm sure that Walter and Demetrius do as well. And Sean, what do you think that the impact of COVID-19 is going to have in terms of exonerees, their health, and also financially?
Well, I mean, all of our clients are also starting years behind their peers. So they have come out of prison, oftentimes after decades. They haven't had the same financial opportunities. They haven't been able to save for homes. They don't have employment history. And as Michele Nethercott said, they don't actually have access to the same services that people have when they're released on parole. So they're already starting behind the 8 ball. And when you have a situation like this where the economy is crashing, they are incredibly vulnerable. We have a lot of clients who have come out recently, and the way layoffs work is last hired, first fired. So one of our clients who hasn't even been out for a year yet was laid off a couple of weeks ago. So I think it really is a struggle. As Michele Nethercott mentioned, substandard healthcare in prison, encountering that for years means that a lot of the exonerees are particularly vulnerable to things like COVID-19 because they've had untreated issues that linger for years. And so, I'm really worried. I have several clients that we are really concerned about because they didn't have access to good health care, and their economic situations are vulnerable enough that they're not necessarily in a position to have access to good health care now.
And what about your clients who are currently behind bars? What are you hearing from them, or what are your concerns about them?
So, as Michele Nethercott had said, we have a ton of concerns about our clients behind bars because of just the circumstances of prison and what prison is. We're not hearing a ton from our clients because, of course, they can't get much to us and we don't have much access to our mail. But what we are hearing, we heard from a client last week who is just utterly terrified. He and his family are fairly convinced that this is going to end very badly for this particular client, and he's just kind of lying in wait to get hit with the disease. We have another case where
and what do you think that...
Oh, go ahead. You froze on me for a second.
No. I want to hear this. I want to hear the second case. Please continue.
So we also recently won a case in federal court in Maryland, and the state's planning to appeal, but they're actually working with us to try to get our client out on electronic monitoring, which is amazing. But because of COVID-19, we are running up against so many stumbling blocks that are, even more difficult to deal with than the usual stumbling blocks we face in these cases. So, for example, we're looking to put our client on electronic monitoring, which is an ankle monitor typically. Well, no one can put an ankle monitor on anyone right now because of coronavirus. We are trying to figure out how our client will be transported from a prison in Maryland to the place he's going in Pennsylvania, but there's no one who can take him because the person whose house he's going to has an underlying medical condition, and there's just no one else who can do it. So, it has really, even in a situation where the state is trying to work with us to get a client out, it is incredibly difficult to, get everything to fall into place so it can actually happen.
And Sean, what steps do you think that the Division of Corrections should be taking to slow the spread of COVID-19 in the prison system?
I think there are some very basic things that they can start doing to, first off, protect the most vulnerable prisoners, and then from there, make sure we're not adding more people to prisons. So, you can prioritize the immediate release of prisoners who are elderly or otherwise medically vulnerable. You can release people who are about to be released anyway. That's not a very complicated, they're going home anyway. Why not let them go home now? Don't start implementing new prison sentences right now. Especially if people aren't currently detained, there's just no reason to do that and keep the virus spreading. Release people held on probation and parole technical violations. These typically aren't violent offenses. These are very, very de minimis things in a lot of circumstances, and there's no reason to keep those people incarcerated. Make sure people who are released have a transition plan that involves medical care instead of leaving people who have been incarcerated for decades to just fend for themselves, which can be incredibly difficult. Those are a few of the things that I think would help and that I know other advocates have been pushing for. And, I just think that I think a lot of politicians and a lot of policymakers are hesitant to do things that help prisoners. But it helps the whole community. If prisons are safer and prison guards are safer, then it's one way that the spread can be slowed and that we can, keep people safe and healthy.
Thank you so much, Sean. And just before we leave you, a really quick question about changing subjects. So you're going to be in a Netflix series that's going to premiere on April 15th. Can you talk about that a little and why people should tune in?
Well, if you're already tuning into this, I think you have a strong interest in wrongful convictions, in things we can do to make the criminal justice system better, in the stories of exonerees. And the Netflix series is going to really do just an incredible job telling a lot of those stories and weaving those issues together. It is a 9-part series called The Innocence Files that covers 3 different causes of wrongful convictions through 9 separate cases. There are Academy Award-winning documentary directors involved. It is really fantastic stuff. And the episode I'm in is just an incredible story involving a client of ours who was convicted of raping 3 women, but was innocent, and has actually become friends with one of the women who misidentified him. So it tells his story, but it also tells their story together. And I think it's just going to make for an incredible production. So I'm really excited to get to see it. Hope people will watch.
That's really exciting. And we'll have a link to the Netflix trailer. And again, it's April 15th. So next I'll turn to our final panelist, and he's last but certainly not least, Walter Lomax. Many of you know Walter Lomax because he's really a figure at the Capitol. He advocates for a number of criminal justice issues. He also spent 39 years in prison for a murder in Baltimore that he didn't commit. He was released from prison in 2006 and officially exonerated in 2014. And he's worked for years on fixing the exoneree compensation. So, Walter, it's so good to see you. And I wanted to start by asking you, I think a lot of people read the story, and some of us were there. You said you put your back into this bill, and that was certainly true. You suffered, unfortunately, from a heart attack right before a hearing on the compensation bill this year. So how are you doing right now? You look great. How are you feeling? I think you're muted, Walter. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm doing great, Michelle.
Wow, and you look great, and thank you so much for joining us. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling great as well, right? Considering what I've been through.
Absolutely. And you said that you completed physical therapy and you've been moving around.
Yes, in fact, my physical therapist released me from jail today, so
Congratulations. That is wonderful news. And just to talk about your, experience as an exoneree, you told me this story that was really touching, that you had this birthday party when you first got out called your 60-40 birthday party. Can you talk about that more? Because I think it really captures the experience of a lot of wrongfully convicted people.
Yes. My family wanted to host a birthday party for me, and they were looking for a theme, and we realized that it was my 60th birthday, and I mentioned the fact that this was the first birthday that I had spent as a free man in over 40 years, and so the theme became the 60/40 birthday party. So I was turning 60, and it's the first birthday that I spent as a free person in over 40 years.
That's amazing. And I guess what would you want people to know is the biggest thing that you lost in all those years in prison? I know you went in when you were only 20 years old. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, even now, when we have family gatherings and we're sitting around and the family is reminiscing, and I'm listening to the stories that they tell, even though I'm there and a part of the family, I realize that I really wasn't a part of that. And so I'm there, but I'm just physically there. I'm not able to mentally share with those experiences. And then my children were 2 and 3 when I went to prison, and I missed the opportunity of being a part of their lives as they grew. When I was released, they had children, and their children had begun to have children. So missing all of those experiences.
Right. And I mean, you finally got compensated in October after waiting for so many years, but you're still fighting to fix the law, even though you already got compensation. Why do you think that fair compensation is so important?
You will never be able to take back what was taken from these people who've had this experience. I mean, that's something that could never be done. And when this process first started for me, I wasn't even thinking in terms of being monetarily compensated. It was creating a process so that if someone had been wrongly convicted, that could be dealt with. They could be made whole, I guess, in a sense. And this is why the actual innocence petition or statute was created. And moving toward, I guess, an equitable amount of compensation. Well, what I realized is that even though it took me from 2006 to 2019 to be compensated, I recognized and understood what I went through all of those years and how difficult of a process that it was for me. And even though I had an excellent support system, I was recognizing that most folk that were coming out did not have the benefit of what I had. And so my thoughts was, or still is for that matter, right, is that something should be done so that at the very least, they can be compensated so that their lives can be made a hell of a lot more easier than it was or has been for people that have came out in the past.
Absolutely. And you're part of the group of 12 exonerees that came to Annapolis in January and talked about the importance of compensation. What did that feel like to have a group of exonerees there advocating with you?
That was great. That was really, really great, because this is the first time since my release that this has been done. I mean, where we actually had other people that were impacted to actually be there. And it was either one of the, Michele or Sean said earlier about, or it may have been you when you were speaking earlier about how impactful those voices were when they were being heard, when the legislators were actually coming out speaking that how much they supported getting this done. This was, I mean, very, 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 very powerful. We've had advocates, groups like the Innocent Project, like Michele and Sean before, advocating on behalf of this issue, but this was the first time. And then we've had family members and friends from some of those folk down there, because some of them, their family members were still incarcerated.
Mm.
But this was the first time that we actually literally had them there, and I thought that was very, very powerful.
Yeah, it was really, really touching. it was a really incredible day when everyone was there together. And ultimately, I mean, we made a lot of progress on the bill, but it didn't pass, and it kind of got killed in the final day of session because of the COVID-19 crisis. How did it feel when you found out the news that it didn't pass this year?
I was naturally disappointed, but I wouldn't use the term that it got killed. It just got delayed because we have more than the momentum to get this legislation passed, and I'm very confident that it will be passed, and that the legislators that got it held up this year. I think it's a good thing that you actually pointed them out, right? And I think that they should be pointed out a little more, like when there are op-eds or interviews that are being done, that they be shamed for what they've done, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, accountability.
Talk about the coronavirus, even in the absence of that, their lives will still be difficult, right, as it is, because as Michele mentioned, that when these folk are coming home, they don't even have access. Let me give you the short version of something that happened to me when I was released. I was at the agency that you go to when you're actually released from prison, where you have to go and sign in. And I went there and so that I could, I guess, turn my paperwork in, because I was being released from the Division of Corrections. And I was asking the lady, what was I entitled to? I thought that I could get some medical insurance or something, so to say. And she told me that I wasn't entitled to anything. In fact, I said, well, I just spent almost 40 years in prison for a crime that I didn't commit. I know I should be entitled to something. And she looked up at me and said, Mr. Lomax, you're holding up my line. So I was absolutely entitled to nothing, zero.
Wow.
And that is the case. And those folk that are being released, such as us, that were actually innocent, we're not entitled to anything. And if we don't have a support system or some type of support system, then it's extremely difficult.
That's a really profound story. That's really shocking that was a response. And after spending so many years in the prison system, what are your concerns about COVID-19 in Maryland? And do you keep in touch with any friends inside the prison system? And what have they been saying about this?
Yes, I definitely keep in contact with people inside the prison system. Aside from my advocacy for compensation for folk who've been wrongly convicted, in fact, the Maryland Restorative Justice Initiative, its primary focus was on parole reform. We've been advocating for years to remove politics from the parole process for people that are serving parole-eligible life sentences. And so we have lifer coordinators at all the major institutions in the system. And so we keep in contact with them on a regular basis. In fact, just before the lockdown, I was able to receive phone calls from them explaining to me some of the things that was going on inside there. My concern is, having been in there, is great. I mean, based on what we are being asked to do out here, to not congregate in large groups and to separate ourselves or do lockdowns and things, people in prison can't do that, right? And in most cases, their cells are at least double to a cell. And in some cases, or in a lot of cases, that is for that matter, they are dormitory areas. And so it's almost impossible to not come in contact with people. Now, and staff has to work. And the medical systems inside prisons almost always just receive the bare minimum. And so it's literally scary to think what some of these men and women could possibly going through at this crucial time. I mean, I've never had experienced anything like this in my lifetime, and I'm 73 years old. And certainly we had some conditions that existed during the periods while I was incarcerated, but nothing of this magnitude. And so I just have great concern as to how this is going to play out for folk on the inside.
Absolutely. And we have a question from someone on Facebook Live. Do you ever get tired of telling your story, and does it ever drag you backwards?
I never get tired when it helps someone. That's why I'm on this panel today, because I've created anything that I could offer to maybe to help further this issue. Then I certainly want to be a part of it. I don't particularly like telling my story because I don't want my story to overshadow the issue, the big issue. I like to stay on point as far as what the issue is concerned. But anytime my story could help an issue, I certainly don't get tired of telling it then. But from a personal perspective, this is something that has been behind me. I mean, everybody that needs to know or that was of concern to me that I was an innocent person that spent that kind of time incarcerated, know that. And so if anything that I can do to help prevent somebody else from maybe having a similar experience, then I certainly don't mind telling my story.
And Walter, one more question from Twitter for you. When you were released and you were finally exonerated, was your record wiped clean, and are you now able to vote?
Yes. Well, the record it's probably wiped clean now but it went through the process. But I was able to vote the next year after I was released.
That's great. And just one final question for you, Walter, before we wrap up. We're all in this uncertain time, and people are really trying to find some kind of hope. What gave you hope through all those years that you were wrongfully incarcerated?
Well, I knew I didn't commit the crime. That was it. And I knew that I was coming up out of there. I didn't know when, and I didn't know how. And somewhere along the line, I came up with the motto is that I was going to never give in and I was never going to give up. And in fact, when I had the heart attack and the stroke, someone told me that this was certainly the time to adhere to that motto, to never give in and never give up. And so that's what I maintained. I knew that I didn't commit the crime, and I knew I was coming up out of there.
That is a great motto. I think all of us can take with us, to never give up and never give in. And we're going to continue fighting for fair exoneree compensation. And I want to thank everyone that joined us today for this conversation. Thank you to everybody who gave us great questions on social media. And we have the website. We have a link on Facebook where you can sign up to keep posted on this issue. And again, thank you for coming today, and have a great rest of your day.
Oh, thanks, Michele.
Thanks.
Thank you all.